History of Chanukah, basically. We haven't got up to Chanukah yet, but you'll recall that after the death of Alexander of Macedonia, his empire was split into four things, but for Jewish history, there are only two divisions that are significant. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which had Egypt and North Africa, and the Seleucid dynasty that had Syria and Turkey. And for over 100 years, there were various wars between the two dynasties. And if you look at a map, you will see that Eretz Yisrael is right in the middle. And therefore, Eretz Yisrael was a football between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty. Now, here's the thing. In terms of Jewish life, it didn't make much of a difference. Things were bad no matter where you went. But in the Ptolemaic dynasty, that's where you had Alexandria, the gigantic city, and that is where the translation of the Torah was made into Greek by the 70 elders, who were put into separate chambers. That's called the Targum HaShivim, or the Greek word for it is the Septuagint. And again, I want to repeat because I don't want to get any, it's not hate mail, but I don't want to get mail teaching me chidushim. I am aware that the Septuagint in the Gemara is only the Chamishe Chumshei Torah, even though if you get the Septuagint in a book, you will see the whole Tanakh. But remember that all of the books, other than the 5 books of Moses, were written later. That is not what the 70 elders translated. The 70 elders only translated the Chumash. Okay, so the word Septuagint is not identical to the Targum HaShivim that Chazal refer to. Now, I went over this just b'kitzur. You recall that it's very, very interesting that Chazal described the completion of the Targum HaShivim as a tragic event. It actually mentions that darkness descended on the world for 3 days when the Torah was translated into Greek. It was considered to be a tragic event. The Gemara doesn't explain what was so tragic about the Torah being translated into Greek. What is Gefelach? So the Gemara doesn't say, but there are different understandings Meforshim have. Some Meforshim say that when you translate the Torah into other languages, you're giving non-Jews a certain influence in the Torah. They can now interpret, they can now distort, they could bring things in that would not be emes anymore, and therefore it's better to keep it in Hebrew, because that way it cannot be infiltrated, so to speak, by non-Jewish cultures. That's one svara. Another svara is the idea that all translations, even if it's a good translation, even if it's a proper translation, by definition are only going to capture one of many infinite meanings, right? The Torah has shivim panim laTorah. There are 70 interpretations to the Torah, and that's lav dafka, by the way. There's actually more than that. But in a translation, you're only capturing one of those nuances, so you're missing so much. And then there's a third explanation, that the tragedy is that the Jewish people needed, at least in Alexandria, the Jewish people needed a translation because they were unable to understand. They were so assimilated that they were unable to understand the Torah in Hebrew. So on one hand, it was a necessary thing, and on the other hand, it was a tragic thing. Now, I remember this all the way back. Art Scroll, Baruch Hashem, has become such a gigantic publisher, a translator of Svarim, the Bavli, the Yerushalmi, the Medrash, the Siddur, the Chumash, the rest of Tanakh. Tremendous, tremendous thing. But I remember back in the 1970s, the very first Art Scroll was McGillis Esther. And it was meant to be a one-time project. It's quite amazing. Rev Meir Zlotowitz, Zichronu Livracha, the founder of Art Scroll, was a graphic artist. He did kasuvas, he did benchers. He was a graphic artist. That was his parnasa. A friend of his died, so he thought, Le'iloi Nishmaso, he would do a one-time anthology of commentaries on Megillas Esther. And he tried to do it by the Shloshim, and this was intended to be mamash, a one-time thing, and then he would go back to invitations and kasuvas. He had to work pretty hard to do a Megillas, even to do a Megillas Esther by Shloshim. It was hard work, but he worked very hard. And Baruch Hashem, he produced the first Art Scroll, McGillis Esther, the very first one. and he fully intended to go back to graphic artist. But the Gedolim said, no, you got to keep on doing this, etc. And then ArtScroll became ArtScroll, with all that it became. I think they still have a graphic arts division, but it used to be the main thing, and now it's like a tiny little part of the Svarim that they publish. So I remember at the time, people were praising ArtScroll. They said, this is so wonderful that we now have the ability to bring in commentaries, meforshim, chazals, to people who don't know Hebrew, and people who, even if they know Hebrew, but they don't have the time or the ability to look for sources. So someone else said, and this was in the Old Jewish Observer, that was a very well-known from magazine that is no longer publishing, that someone said, well, you have to remember that when the Torah was translated to make it more accessible to everybody, that was considered to be sad. It was sad that they needed it. So as a result, the attitude towards ArtScroll would be kind of double. Thank God that we have it, and it's so sad that we need it. So it's the same thing. In other words, on one hand, it addresses a really, really important need, and Baruch Hashem that we have it. Again, it's like crutches, like any crutch, right? If a person, God forbid, has broken their legs, and they need to walk on crutches. So thank God you have crutches, but chaval that you need crutches, right? So that's the same thing. This is like a crutch. So be it as it may, I just want to point out that Chazal's attitude towards the Targum HaShivim was one of sadness. But just to give you an insight into how assimilated Alexandrian Jewry was, they made it a Yom Tov on the day that the Septuagint was completed. They celebrated every year. This was a chag. I mean, it wasn't a drabanan technically, but the minhag was they celebrated the day of the siyum of the Septuagint in Teves. They made it a Yom Tov. So you see the difference. Our Chachamim in Eretz Yisrael looked at this as a sad thing. The assimilated Jews in Alexandria looked at it like a great, great, great simcha. But be it as it may, we're going back and forth. Eretz Yisrael is going back and forth between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Seleucid dynasty. This was prophesied in the book of Daniel, Perek Yud Aleph, by a series of wars between the so-called king of the north and the king of the south. Daniel saw this b'nevuah much, much earlier. So now we get to I'm going to use some secular dates, the secular year 199 before the Common Era. 199 before the Common Era. And we have a king, Antiochus IV, who is a Seleucid king. Antiochus III. He's not the guy, he's not the villain of Chanukah yet. And Antiochus III is known in history as Antiochus the Great, although we don't consider him particularly great. And Antiochus the Great waged a great military campaign against the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. And he was able to conquer unto his empire Judea, which is Eretz Yisrael, and Phoenicia, which would correspond more or less to modern-day Lebanon. He wrested it from the Ptolemaic dynasty, and that was considered to be a great, great military conquest. And again, in the book of Daniel, which is much earlier, it talks about the great military exploits of the king of the north against the king of the south. So now Eretz Yisrael is, and the Jewish population obviously, is under, other than the Jews who live in Alexandria. A lot of Jews live in Alexandria, but the Jewish population of Eretz Yisrael was now under the rule of the Seleucid dynasty in Syria, right? Their capital was a city, Antioch, in Syria. Antioch, just like Alexandria, is named after Alexander. Antioch in Syria was named after Antiochus, but there were a lot of Antiochuses. Antiochus III, meaning there were two before him. Antiochus III died a few years later. He was not such a bad guy. He actually let the Jews keep mitzvos. But Antiochus III was succeeded by the villain of the Chanukah story, Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV gave himself a name. Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus, divine incarnate, meaning he proclaimed himself the physical incarnation of divinity. Antiochus Epiphanes. Behind his back, his own people, even the non-Jewish population, changed one letter of his name. Instead of calling him Antiochus Epiphanes, they called him Antiochus Epimanes, which in Greek means Antiochus the crazy one. So Epiphanes means divine incarnate. Epimanes means Meshuggah. And Antiochus in many ways was Meshuggah. And Antiochus was the first one of the Seleucid kings, and even the Ptolemaic kings, who basically said the following. Ever since Alexander conquered the Persian Empire and took all of these countries under his wing, Alexander had a certain cultural agenda that was called Hellenism. Hellas was the Greek name for Greece. It actually means beauty. And I don't want to repeat, but we talked about the other day that Yavan comes from Yephes, Noach's third son, and Yephes was given a blessing that they will have a capacity to generate beauty in the world, and this was taken over by Yavan. Yavan has a koyach to create beauty in many, many forms, whether it's art, whether it's mathematics, whether it's philosophy, whether it's even athletics, the glorification of the human body, and this was Yephes. Yavan was given this koyach of generating Yafi, and Alexander was determined to spread the culture of Hellas, called Hellenism, throughout his entire empire. Not just Eretz Israel, the whole empire that Alexander had conquered. But Alexander did not do it by coercion. Alexander did it by assimilation, by persuasion, by building temples and building stadiums and building coliseums and all of those different things. And many, many people, including many, many Jews, simply fell for it without any coercion. Nobody put a gun to their head. They just said, hey, this is a nice way of life. We like it. We're comfortable. Let's assimilate. Let's give in. Let's be like everybody else. The same thing that happens, let's say, in modern Western culture today. Nobody's putting a gun to your head and telling you, get rid of Torah and mitzvahs. So the truth of the matter is, Hellenism, unfortunately, was quite successful way before Antiochus IV came on the scene. Meaning, it was working anyway. But Antiochus thought it was working a little too slowly. So he was the first one of the kings who wanted to create Hellenism by coercion rather than assimilation and persuasion. And as a result, he promulgated a lot of decrees, and this is already the familiar part of the Chanukah story, keneged the observance of the Torah. Now again, you have to understand what's going on here. It's not that he hated the Torah per se, but he looked at the Torah as something that's blocking the assimilation that he wants all of his populations to do by becoming like Greek. He wanted a unified empire of ideology, etc. And the problem was that these Jews were sticking out like a sore thumb and they weren't mixing. So there are many, many different versions of what were the gezeros of Antiochus. One of them was that he prohibited bris milah, he prohibited circumcision. Part of that was connected to the fact that he wanted Jews to participate in athletic games like the Olympics, and the Greeks did it naked, so he didn't want there to be a difference in how a body of a Jew looked. Prohibited the observance of Shabbos, prohibited the sanctification of the new moon, Rosh Chodesh, that determined the Jewish calendar. And then there were things that were even worse. The Gemara in Kesuvos records that he adopted a policy. Now, this was not all at one time, but at different times. He adopted a policy that the night that a woman was married to her husband, she first had to be with one of his officials, Tiboel Lehegma Techila. And many people had weddings in secret, but unfortunately, for many people, there was such tragic abuse that took place. didn't allow women to go to the mikveh. There are many, many different lists. There's Shabbos, there's Rosh Chodesh, Bris Milah. That's the famous list. Took away, didn't want people to keep Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, Bris Milah, but there are many other things. There's Tiboel LeHegmain, there's being with first intercourse with the officer. There was taking away of the mikveh. He didn't allow there to be a kesuva even in a marriage. He would not permit the writing of a kesuva. According to other versions, you were not even allowed to say the name of Hashem in any way, although I don't know if they could see that in private, but you were not allowed to publicly even mention the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You would be killed if you just mentioned God in that way. So there's actually a total of 13 or 14 different gezeros that Antiochus did. And as a result, there were Jews who succumbed and they didn't do these mitzvos or they did these averos because of Antiochus. And then there were Jews who refused to give in, and some of them were killed. There are many, many stories of martyrdom, of people who were killed, al Kiddush Hashem, because they did not give in. And finally, what happened was that Antiochus' army desecrated the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. That's as part of the persecution. They decided they would desecrate the Beis HaMikdash. They did not destroy the Beis HaMikdash, right? There was no Chorban Beis HaMikdash, but maybe they did worse. They desecrated it. They invaded it, number one. They built houses of prostitution as part of the sacred prostitution. That was a form of Avodah Zarah that they were engaged in. They sacrificed chazerim, pigs, on the Mizbeach to Avodah Zarah. They put up statues of Avodah Zarah. Baruch Hashem, they did not desecrate the luchos or the Torah in the Kodesh HaKodashim, because in the second Beis HaMikdash there were no luchos. There was no Aron HaKodesh, so they couldn't do that. But they desecrated the menorah. They did many, many different things. And it's interesting that they entered the Beis HaMikdash on the 25th of Kislev, meaning the day that later would become Chanukah, 3 years before that. As they were Mechalel, the Beis HaMikdash, on the 25th of Kislev itself. Now, the Mishnah in Maseches Midos is not about good Midos, that's Pirkei Avos. But Maseches Midos means dimensions. It is about the description of the Bayis Sheni. It describes the Bayis Sheni. And it mentions that when you entered the HaRabayis, so the first fence you would encounter after you entered the HaRabayis was a wicker fence that was called the Soreg. Soreg just means a wicker fence. And from the wicker fence, you would then enter the Ezras Nashim, and you would enter different parts of the temple's Azara, temple's courtyard, and the like. Now it mentions, the Mishnah says, that there were 13 places in the Soreg that the Yevanim broke through when they desecrated the Beis HaMikdash. And when the Chachamim had those fences repaired, in the Chanukah story, they were gozer that every time you pass a place that the Yevanim broke through, you bow down to Hashem, giving gratitude for the restoration of the pirtzas, the breaking, the breaches in the Soreg. It's interesting, why did they have to break through? I mean, they could have just gone through the gate. The answer is, interestingly enough, the Soreg demarcated how far non-Jews were allowed to go in the HaRabayis, meaning a non-Jew was allowed to enter the HaRabayis until the Soreg. The Soreg was the fence that essentially said non-Jews are not allowed to enter. In fact, we actually have a sign that's recovered from the Bayis Sheni that says, it gave you a warning, the consequences are pretty severe. Any non-Jew who walks behind this point may be summarily executed without warning. So it's kind of, it's like kind of sudden death. Do not walk past this line. Now one can understand that once the Yevanim are in control, they bedafka are going to show their rage against the Soreg. Soreg is the fence, because the Soreg is telling them they can't go in. They're going to break it down and go in. So now we have this scene where, number one, throughout Eretz Yisrael, so there are different things happening here. Throughout Eretz Yisrael, Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes, has all of these anti-religious decrees, no Shabbos and no Bris Milah, and no Kiddush HaChodesh, and not keeping kosher, and no mikveh, and Tiba'el Lahegmon Techila, the idea that the officer of the king has the right to have first relations with the woman. That's a persecution existing throughout Eretz Yisrael. And to make it even worse, right, the Beis HaMikdash is under the control of the Yevanim. So that has two consequences. Number one, that means we can't do our Avodah. We're not bringing the Tamid, we're not bringing the Musaf, we're not lighting the menorah, we're not bringing the Ketores, we can't go into the Beis HaMikdash at all. But not only that, but they're actively desecrating the Beis HaMikdash in all different ways. So this is the situation during the reign of Antiochus IV. And again, his agenda was coerced Hellenism. And as I say, number one, a lot of Jews were Hellenists without any coercion. They were doing it anyway. Number two, some Jews did give in to him. Number three, some Jews were willing to be martyred and the like. So now we begin with the heroes of the story. We have an elderly man who lived in a town, Modi'in, which is not exactly where Modi'in is today, but nearby. His name was Matisyahu, right? And in the Al Anisim prayer that we recited last night and today, and we're going to be saying it for the 8 days of Chanukah, he is described as Matisyahu ben Yochanan. Let's look at the beginning of Al Anisim. Bimei, in the days of Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Hashmonai ubanav. Now, that seems like a pretty easy sentence to translate, even if you're not that skillful in Hebrew. The words are pretty simple. In the days of Matisyahu, the Kohen Gadol, Hashmonai, and his sons. But you know, it's like the old Yiddish saying that a person could write Noach with 7 mistakes. That's pretty hard to do. This is a very short little phrase, and there are a number of interpretive problems here. All right, there's a fellow, Matisyahu ben Yochanan. It says Kohen Gadol. Now, first of all, what does Kohen Gadol mean? So, the simple meaning, the first thing you think about when you hear the word Kohen Gadol is he was Kohen Gadol. In other words, it's a position, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. Okay, that's fine. But what is it going on? Is it going on Yochanan or is it going on Matisyahu? Who is the Kohen Gadol? In the days of Matisyahu ben Yochanan, Kohen Gadol, Matisyahu was the Kohen Gadol? Or Matisyahu was the son of an earlier Kohen Gadol who's called Yochanan. So that's question number one. Who is Kohen Gadol going on? Is it going on Matisyahu or is it going on Yochanan? Now, here is the thing. There is no evidence from any other source that Matisyahu ever had the position of Kohen Gadol. In fact, we have other people who were Kohen Gadols, and they were Hellenists and the like, actually. They were allies with Antiochus. On the other hand, we do have, in several places in Shas, a discussion of Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Right? Now, the problem is, of course, Yochanan is not an uncommon name, so you're never sure. Are you talking about, is Yochanan Kohen Gadol of the Gemara Matisyahu's father? Now, what do we know about Yochanan Kohen Gadol? Yochanan Kohen Gadol. We know contradictory things, actually. One thing we know about Yochanan Kohen Gadol is he made a number of important takanos. And one of those takanos that he made, just to mention an example, is he made a takana called Demai. Demai, whole Maseches in Mishnayos. Demai in a Maseches in the Yerushalmi of Gemara, in Seder Zerayim. Demai is a rule that when you buy grain in Eretz Yisrael or fruits and vegetables in Eretz Yisrael from someone who's an Am Haaretz, you are mechuyev to separate maisris because your choshesh, the Am Haaretz, didn't do the job. This is called demai. Right? There's a whole maseches about the complications of demai. So that would seem to indicate that he was a righteous man. He made takanos to strengthen the learning, to strengthen the observance of Torah. But then we read something else about Yochanan Kohen Gadol, that he was a righteous person and he was a Kohen Gadol for 80 years. 80 years to be Kohen Gadol. I mean, let's assume he became Kohen Gadol at 15, which is not likely. So 95 years old. And then he became a Sadducee. He became a Tzduki. At the end of his life, after 80 years of righteousness, Yochanan Kohen Gadol became a Tzduki, a Sadducee who did not believe in the oral law. And essentially, Tzdukim were Hellenists in and of themselves. And the Gemara applies the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, which is very disheartening and very pessimistic. Al tamin biatzmacha ad yom mosecha. Do not believe in yourself until the day of death, meaning never be confident that you're not going to commit sins. A person might say, oh, those temptations are above me. I'm beyond that. Unfortunately, we're never beyond it. And the raya is Yochanan Kohen Gadol was righteous for 80 years. He became a Tzduki. Now, there's a lot of problems. Is that the same Yochanan Kohen Gadol who made it the Kana of Demai, or is there another Yochanan? Right? That itself is a big, big problem. But the interesting question is, this is a speculation that some Mefarshim say, but they don't have a raya. If you understand that the Yochanan Kohen Gadol is Matisyahu's father, in other words, Matisyahu's father was the one who became a Tzduki after 80 years. You can now understand why Matisyahu was so adamant that we have to fight this poison. Because he saw in his own family what Hellenism destroyed. He saw. You see, now you understand why he had such a revolutionary fervor. Because he saw that it took a righteous person and made him a Tzduki. So according to that interpretation, just bekitzer, when it says, in the days of Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, according to this interpretation, Kohen Gadol is not going on Matisyahu. Kohen Gadol is going on Yochanan. In the days of Matisyahu, the son of Yochanan, the Kohen Gadol. And this might be, everything is a might here, there's no for sure. This might be the Yochanan Kohen Gadol who became a Sadducee, became a Tzduki after 80 years. Now, other Mefarshim actually say Kohen Gadol is either going on Matisyahu or it's going on both. They both were Kohanim Gedolim. And yet another pshat says, okay, Matisyahu was not a Kohen Gadol, but Kohen Gadol doesn't mean high priest, it just means a great Kohen, a Kohen that was a Gadol, which is a little dochik because that's not the normal usage of the word Kohen Gadol. Right, so you're already pretty stuck, right? It's like, bimei, we know what that means, in the days of. Okay, so that word we're safe. In the days of Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, we already have ambiguities right there. Yeah.
If the Kohen today has a forbidden relationship or forbidden marriage with another Jew who he's not allowed to be married to, is that child who would be disqualified as being a Kohen within things so a Kohen? If he's not can a Kohen today have a name can a non-Kohen today have a name that has been?
No, but first of all, I don't understand where you're getting that. In other words, I didn't say that Yochanan had you're asking a general question? Yochanan did not have a forbidden marriage as far as you know.
I know.
Yeah.
But my question to that is because can someone have the last part, a title that says like Hashmonai, for example,
Oh, I got you.
Can someone have that?
Right, so let's take a simple example. Right. Let's take a simple example. Let's say a Kohen marries a Gerusha. A Kohen marries a divorced woman. So the child of the Kohen who marries a divorced woman is called a Chalal. He's desecrated, and he's not a Kohen. So in the Kesuva, let's say his name is Ruvain, and his father is Aaron. Would we write Ruvain ben Aaron HaKohen, because technically Aaron is a Kohen. Aaron is a Kohen, even though Ruvain is not a Kohen. Yeah, that's a very excellent point. Technically you could, but we would not write it because of the confusion, because it's likely that people would interpret it to go back to the Ruvain, and that wouldn't be emes. So we would.
Do we know what the custom was at that time?
I don't know. Now what we might do, I'll check exactly. We might write, although it's a little embarrassing, Ruvain Chalal ben Aaron Kohen. That might be something you could write. That way you'll know for sure that Kohen is only going on Aaron, it is not going on Ruvain. I don't know what the minhag would have been then, and the like. Okay, now then we come to another. So this is the problem of who is Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol. Now, then let's go further. Hashmonai Ubanav. So what is Hashmonai? So most Meforshim say the following, but you'll see there's a different opinion on this. That Hashmonai is a modifier of Matisyahu. Matisyahu, the son of Yochanan Kohen Gadol, and there we had a doubt, is also called Hashmonai, along with his sons, and then we have the description of the war against Yavan. So according to many interpretations, which is the standard interpretation, Hashmonai is another modifier of Matisyahu. Matisyahu was called Hashmonai, and together with his sons, they're called Hashmonaim. Okay, that is the standard interpretation. The question is, why was Matisyahu called Hashmonai? What does Hashmonai even mean? It's not a clear translation either. There are a few interpretations. Some say that Hashmonai is a modification of a word that appears in Tehillim, Chashmanim. In fact, in Maoz Sur, the Chashmanim are called Chashmanim. Right? It says, Yuvanim nikvetzu alai azai bimei Chashmanim. The Yavanim gathered against me in the days of the Chashmanim. I hope you notice. It doesn't say in the days of Hashmonaim. It says Chashmanim. Now, Chashmanim is a word that appears in Tehillim, which is way before the Chanukah story. And Chashmanim means nobility. So Hashmonai simply means a noble family, a chashuv family, a family of great nobility that would be spiritual qualities. So pshat number one is Hashmonai means the noble one, meaning spiritually, the great one. Matisyahu, the great. Problem is, of course, that Chashmanim and Hashmonaim is not really the same word. It's close, but it is a different word. Call them Chashmanim and call him Chashman, not Hashmonai. That's a different word. So the second interpretation for Hashmonaim is that there was a town in Eretz Yisrael called Hashmona. Hashmona. So Hashmonai simply means that the origin of this family was from even though they're now in Modi'in, the Chanukah story, Matisyahu is in Modi'in, but the origin of the family was Hashmona. So Hashmonai means a family. I just like, right? You have modern Jewish names. Somebody might be called Berlin. Somebody might be called Amsterdam. Somebody might be called London, right? These are Jewish names. London, Frankfurter, Hamburger, right? It doesn't mean it's not related to the meat. It's related to the city. So the concept is that one of the names that Jews would sometimes take on, or were given, is their geographical origin. So Hashmonai means a family from Hashmonai. Okay. But all of this is assuming the thing that most of us assume, Pashat Pshat, that Hashmonai is referring to Matisyahu. Matisyahu is Hashmonai. But there's a whole other Pshat that there are two different heroes in the Chanukah story. There's a hero called Matisyahu, and there's another fellow who's called Hashmonai. And it mentions that Matisyahu had 5 sons and Hashmonai had 7 sons. And together they're warriors with a 12 equal to the 12 Shvatim of Yisrael. So the way you read it is this, totally different place of putting the comma. In the days of Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, comma, Hashmonai, comma, and Banav. Banav would go on both of them, and their sons, although it should say B'nayim according to that. Okay, a very interesting machlokas. Most Meforshim learn the way we're always taught. Hashmonai is a modifier of Matisyahu. Matisyahu was called Hashmonai for whatever the reason. Others say, no, there was Matisyahu, and there was another guy, Hashmonai, and they were the leaders of the revolt. Very, very fascinating. If you look in various midrashim, the word midrashim I have to also qualify. There are things that are called medrash l'Chanukah, but you have to be very careful. The medrash l'Chanukah are not authoritative midrashim from Chazal, like the Medrash Rabbah, the Medrash Tanchuma. Although those midrashim were written after Chanukah, they don't have a lot about Chanukah. But the midrashim that give you all sorts of details of Chanukah are much, much later midrashim, from the Middle Ages. So they're not, technically they're not even called midrashim, but the word medrash is used for them. So there is a machlokas, how reliable are they, how authoritative are they, are you somech on them? The Rishonim do quote them occasionally, but they're not really the midrashim of Chazal per se. They date maybe from the Gaonim time, so it's before the Rishonim. From the time of the Gaonim, they compiled various stories. And you'll see in the different midrashim that sometimes Hashmonai is a separate person. In fact, in one of the midrashim, a daughter of Matisyahu marries a man called Hashmonai. In other words, mamish like two different people. But as I say, most Meforshim do understand the way we were taught growing up, that Hashmonai is a modifier of Matisyahu. Okay, so we did the first line of the Hellenism. Tomorrow we'll talk about the war against Yavan, the reclaiming of the Beis HaMikdash, and how we get to a holiday of Chanukah. Yeah.
Why was it written so vaguely? Why weren't they more?
It's interesting. Part of it is because the midrashim, to the degree, whatever authority they have, are contradictory, are ambiguous. And as a result, we just don't have a lot of clarity. So things are worded in ways that are susceptible to different interpretations simply because we literally don't understand exactly what happened. In fact, one very interesting thing you may want to look at, I'm not sure if it's in the Art Scroll Siddur. There are special piyutim for Chanukah that we don't recite. Most shuls do not recite them today, but there are piyutim for Chanukah that were said by some kehilos and still are said by some kehilos. And in those piyutim, they really go through, in the piyutim, all of these midrashim on Chanukah. So in a way, it's a chaval that we don't say them because they actually have a lot of interesting stories and a lot of interesting information. And the different nuschais of these piyutim will reflect different midrashim. Yeah.
Rolling back to one of the earlier discussions in this year, why was it a sad day today like the mashal? It's a sad day for a father when his son breaks his leg. It's not sad when he gets the crushes. So why like what Chazal told us something was going to change and now it's like the point of no return?
Well, I tell you, it could be, it's interesting, based on what I said before, that in Alexandria they rejoiced when it was completed. So maybe the sadness may have been connected to the rejoicing. Like, why are you rejoicing? It's as if to say, you're happy that your legs are broken, meaning to say, So it could be that until it was completed, there was not this celebration in the streets, as it were. Okay, we'll see you.